This presentation is part of a research project through the McGill School of Social Work, and Jill Hanley, Manuel, and myself were a part of it, and so it's a focus on. It was a 3-year longitude study on immigrant workers who worked particularly through temporary placement agencies inside of Montreal, and and looking at the labor violations that they faced, but also the intersections between immigration, labor, and also the vulnerabilities faced by the role of temporary placement agencies within the labor market within immigrant communities. And so the concepts that we looked at were around consent, circumvention, or contestation in regards to the violations that workers faced and the difficult choices that they have to make in terms of whether to accept or to challenge the violations that they faced. So in looking at this, consent, sort of accepting the violation to preserve their employment as being the primary goal of the immigrant worker. The other is to circumvent, so how immigrant workers in particular find ways to either to avoid or lessen the violation while trying to not create any sense of confrontation or conflict with the employer or government agency in particular. And then contestation in terms of how workers actually try to contest or to confront, whether it be through the process of the CNSST, or because this was a study before the CNSST existed. So there was also the CSST as well, and the Commission de Normes de Travail. And so this was through a SHRC Insight grant project. And so the mixed methods of the project in terms of the project looked at 3 different parts of looking at immigrant agency workers or temporary agency workers. So the first was analyzing 62 case files from the Immigrant Worker Center that all had to relate to workers who had violations and who had been working through temporary placement agencies. The second element of the research project was analyzing 44 files of live-in caregiver workers who had gained their employment through recruitment agency from a community organization called PNAI, which is a Filipina domestic workers organization here in Montreal. And then the other part of the research project was a 3-year longitude qualitative study and looking at employment, education, family, and immigration trajectories of 40 immigrant workers who were all temporary placement agency workers in 5 different sectors, and were interviewed 3 times a year for 3 years. So it was quite a long study, and a lot of the final analysis is being done now. And just to give a portrait of the people that we that had participated in the research study. So in regards to agency work, so in terms of gender, so 56% were men, 44% were women. The overwhelming majority of participants were between the ages of 26 to 45. It was roughly 49% of them were single, 51% were married. 68% of them had children, and 43% of the children were in the country of origin. So were not able to actually to come with their parents. And most of the people that we participated or were also part of the project were mainly Francophone speakers, while 65% were actually trilingual. And I think what's also important is that the 2 other ones, so in regards to education, that the overwhelming majority did have post-secondary education, but were trapped in in forms of precarious low-wage work through temporary placement agencies, and that the majority of them wanted to continue their studies within Canada, but because of the barriers of their status, are forced to put that on hold. And the overwhelming, and so in terms of the most important statistics, I think, is that 53% were permanent residents and 47% had precarious status, meaning a variety of status. So 17% were non-status, meaning that that their status had expired, that they faced a deportation order, that they're living without any legal status. And the rest of the 47% could be refugee claimants, could be waiting for a decision on a humanitarian application. So they were being denied permanent residency, but they did not have a deportation order or removal order as of yet. Or they were waiting for their sponsorship. So in terms of the sectors of work that we looked at through the different case files, and also from the 5 sectors, were professionals. So in terms of professional temporary placement agency workers, so whether it be in the gaming industry, clerical work, these sort of sectors, there is quite a bit of agency work or temporary work. And then the second was in the health sector, so people who are préposés, nurses' aides, who work in the health sector in private home care or long-term care. And then the third sector was warehouses, distribution, and logistics, which is quite the phenomenon in Montreal and employs roughly 63,000 people in the city of Montreal. And overwhelming majority were men, were citizens, permanent residents. And then the third and fourth were food transformation, which included much more women, were mainly refugee claimants or undocumented workers. And then day labor. So I know we think of day labor as a phenomenon in the US, but day labor is also a phenomenon quite common in Quebec as well, in terms of particularly in agriculture. And in regards to the ratio between immigrant and non-immigrant labor through temp placement agencies, it is that for 2/3 of the workforce in Quebec are represented within the temporary placement agencies, and that only 13% of the population in general. So I'm just going to end on that. And so in regards to the violations that we found throughout the Immigrant Workers Center in the case studies was a broad breadth of issues that immigrant workers had faced vis-a-vis their temp placement agencies. So looking at the 62 case studies, 48% of the workers, their number one majority complaint had been unpaid wages. The second had been unpaid vacation. So in regards to pecuniary complaints, obviously prohibited practices, which could mean anything from, another form of unjust dismissal, or what they call constructive dismissal within the labor standard. It could mean in regards to the changing of work. It could mean, so prohibited practices is a kind of a wide catchment that has to be used if workers aren't able to actually file an unjust dismissal complaint. And then also harassment was also quite a big issue, where 19% of the cases were around harassment. And the other big element of the issues that temp agencies workers had actually faced was either workplace injuries or unsafe work conditions. And then one thing that wasn't reflected in the case files, but was reflected in the interviews, was that for temporary placement agency workers, the agencies nor the employer actually provide any health and safety equipment. And it's quite standard for temporary workers to actually have to provide their own health and safety equipment. They don't even hide it. Even if it's illegal under 51.1, they actually just put it in their advertisements. If you have your this and this equipment, then you can have a job. So it's actually quite a common practice that's quite aware to actually the CSST inspectors, but because of limited resources, there's little that they do, and agencies are able to circumvent it, saying that why should we pay for someone's boots with the expectations that they're only going to work for a day or 2 days? How can we be held responsible for that? Do you want to go there? Yeah. Okay, so so in regards to then what do workers actually do in this scenario is quite an interesting moment, because despite the amount of labor violations that they actually faced, the question was, why then do they accept it? Why do they actually consent to such violations? Well, throughout the interviews and throughout the research, there are some moments in terms of the lack of knowledge of their rights, that they have rights to go to the Labor Standards Commission, that they have rights to file complaints. But most often, it's not about their knowledge of rights, because most of the times it's a very basic contract. I work, you pay me, and the employer doesn't pay them. So you don't need to be a doctorate in labor law to figure out that right, to be paid for work that you do. So in regards to what workers had actually would make the assessment was an internal cost benefit analysis, right? So in terms of that, are they able to find other employment, that they accept the temporary nature of this, that well, you know, I'm not going to do this job forever. I'm not going to remain within this day labor job. So maybe I won't go to, so in regards to day labor, for a quick example, people will make choices based on the metro station that they will go to. And in the interviews, people will make choices, well, maybe I'll go to Saint Michel Metro this morning, or maybe I'll go to Georges Vanier. But if I go to Georges Vanier Metro at 6 a.m., I'll most likely have to do quail. So when immigrant workers within the day labor industry find work, they never know the name of their employer. The only name, it's organized essentially by fruit or by vegetable. Or the broccoli. So workers in our interviews would tell us that they would get to the metro station, and then it will be an array of school buses, and it'll be cucumbers there, broccoli there, chicken there, quail there, and nobody ever wanted to do the quail, but you had to be there early enough. So in the sense of trying to make that cost-benefit analysis, that, well, maybe I won't go on that bus this morning, or maybe I'll find another source of employment. But then also in terms of going back to the question of care, that most people will wait it out until their status is regulated, that this isn't a long-term work, that this is for those who are not undocumented but are waiting for their status, waiting for their permanent residency. Well, I'll wait it out until I'll be able to go back to school. I need to send remittances back to my family, regardless if those remittances are even $100 a month, become really crucial elements. So
maybe I can add just briefly that is the thing of lack of knowledge of rights. It's, I mean, it could be relativized in many times because it's not only that people doesn't know their rights. I mean, nobody knows their complete rights about labor. I mean, but the thing is that for many of these workers who are super exploited, tired, without energy, worrying in their integration process, trying to find lodging, trying to find sources to send money to families, etc., which is a different trajectory from citizens living here in terms of their life. So it's very difficult to understand which is their location in the triangular labor relationship with the agencies. Besides that, the law doesn't clarify what's the role of agencies and who's the real employer. It's also very difficult for many of these workers to understand what is their location in terms of a worker. I mean, the concept of worker disappears in a certain way, as you have it in unions, for example. Oh, it's, no, so, you want to
So in regards to in terms of like the circumvention of labor rights, and so what workers will do is an individual approach, right? So workers throughout our interviews will take not a sort of a collective approach, but very much an internal form of survival in regards to, you know, classic strategies, and they'll keep the current job while trying to seek other employment or seek employment through multiple agencies as a strategy. And then they won't contest, even if they have the possibility to contest a lot of these things after their employment is terminated. There's still sometimes there can actually be a fear. So in regards to circumvision, they would rather find other means, or sometimes also just wait until the actual employment is better. So these are three examples that are quite common. But they're only relevant to those who are the top two measures are relevant, or the first one is really relevant to those who are permanent residents, who have some degree of status, while the other two are taken sort of informally, right? So individual forms to protect their health and safety. Oh, 2 minutes. Oh. So just quickly, in terms of contestation, so the major forms of contestation for immigrant agency workers is mostly what we realized was that that workers will attempt to contest their violations on the job. For those who have unresolved violations, there are forms of direct action, or with the community organization, or formal legal action with the Labor Standards Board or Health and Safety Board. But what we realized through analyzing the case files, so what makes workers realize that a lot of the times the problem, again, is the triangular relationship in terms of contesting the violation. Right? So they can't, if an agency opens and closes and they have unpaid wages, they can contest it formally at the Labor Standards Board, and the Labor Standards Board will agree, but there's nobody to pay because the agency had disappeared. So this is actually quite a common occurrence. Or a lot of the times they use the triangular relationship to muddy who's actually responsible. So a lot of the times even formal legal action has particular kinds of limitations. And in terms of how workers choose the responses, it's also in terms of the amount of stress, the amount of time required, in terms of immigration status. the type of work contract. So if you're cash or undocumented, a lot of the times it's really hard to prove that you were employed. And technically, even with supposedly not changes, but acceptance by the Labor Standards Commission that if you were to write down your hours, that would be accepted as proof of employment, it's actually still quite a challenge. You have to provide witnesses, you have to give details about the work environment to order to prove, because if you're working cash, there is no proof, and it is quite easy for an employer to deny that they employed you. So it makes it quite difficult. In regards to immigration status, which is tied usually again to working for cash, but also in terms of fear of going to through particular channels to resolve their workplace violations. And then also just the mental health situation of just wanting to move on from a very difficult type of work relation. So in terms of implications, there's a need to recognize and respect migrant workers' stake in deciding how to face labor violations, understanding that formal recourses are inadequate to defend the rights of migrant agency workers, and advocates like the Immigrant Workers Center and others need to begin to think about strategies in terms of direct intervention if the rights are to be protected. So in the sense that directly going to the employer or to the temporary agency as an effective strategy to resolve labor rights violations. And also changing the cost-benefit equation necessary if workers are to move significantly from consent to circumvision to contestation. And also continuing to regulate temp agencies in regards to co-responsibility, the reduction of precarious immigration status, and eligibility for different social benefits are still urgently required, because again, that is also a critical choice that people are made because they can't access the same social rights that citizens can. So then they make or they accept much more difficult choices as a result. Thank you.